Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message. Quick question. What do you do when the warning light on your car flashes? Well, okay, I guess it's more than a rhetorical question, I guess. Some of you take it right in. Some of you. Others of you wait to see if it really develops into anything. Maybe it's just a bad sensor, or others, particularly if it's associated with a loud noise, you just turn up the radio a little bit louder. Or better yet, you get a piece of tape, black, and you put it over that Christmas light on your dashboard. Well, there's been some research done with Gen Z and millennials. It's not to pick on Gen Z and millennials, just that happens to be the focus of it. 6 in 10 Gen Zers and millennials have a complicated relationship with their cars. The recent survey of Gen Z and millennial car owners reveals that it takes an average of 8 warning lights for them to schedule vehicle maintenance. However, 1 in 4 tend to disregard and continue driving with broken speakers or radio or excessive emissions, low tire pressure light, oil change, or scratches on their vehicle's body or windshield. It just, not a big deal. Rub some dirt on it. 2 out of 3 say that they're okay with their car not being up to par as long as it passes a state licensed safety test. Now, we don't really have that here, but in other states they do. And on average, it takes 5 breakdowns for Gen Zers and millennials to buy a new car. So people stop driving the car and get a new one when the upkeep surpasses their budget. That's 39%. There are too many strange sounds or smells, 38%. Too many parts have to be replaced, 37%, or just too much of it is being held together by tape. Also, my vehicle. Somebody had reflected on this and said, the reality is this is also true for most people in their spiritual lives. Regardless of age, doesn't matter the generation. They will ignore the warning signs and continue with sinful behavior as long as they think they are managing to hold it together and get by with it. We've been going through the book of Ezekiel, and if you've been with us, you realize that's the case for Israel. That was the case for God's people. They'd heard the prophets' warning lights, but they just kept ignoring them, assuming it didn't mean anything to them. It really wasn't about them, it's about somebody else. But now they could no longer ignore it. And here's why. Jerusalem has finally been destroyed. It's 587 BC. Nebuchadnezzar finally comes in and destroys the temple, flattens it, destroys the city of Jerusalem, kills many of its people, carries more of them off into exile, leaves some behind. But in the book of Ezekiel, it's going to mark a change. A new season of ministry is about to begin. But not without God taking Ezekiel back to his original calling. And if you remember in the first message or two, Ezekiel has been called as a prophet, or a different term is as a watchman on the walls of the city. And so we're going to take a look at these next couple of chapters, beginning in chapter 33, at this call of Ezekiel being renewed and being reiterated, but also some expansion on it. Some changes are going to come because it's going to be a new season of ministry. So if you want to follow along on your insert. Everything okay with it? Okay, all right. That's good. Yeah. Just make sure that wasn't a body or something. Take a look at your insert. The first move in this passage is that Ezekiel's call is renewed. His call is renewed. And underneath that is faithfulness to the message is commanded. So once again, God brings him back to his calling. Look at chapter 33, beginning in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, when I bring the sword against the land, and the people of the land choose one of their men and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land, and he blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet but does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes their life, their blood will be on their own head. And then down in verse 7, Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. If you've been reading through Ezekiel, you'll notice that this chapter sounds really familiar, really similar to passages from earlier on in Ezekiel, in the first few chapters. Because it is. It's kind of renewing and reiterating what God has already asked him to do. But after the fall, they become a very different people. And so God is going to call him again to be a watchman, but there's going to be some nuances, some things that are going to have to be different about his role in his ministry now. But again, let me remind you what a watchman is. In the ancient world, as a way of protecting the city, and they would not only have walls around the cities, but they would also have a watchman whose job it was to look for marauders and for warring troops coming their way or trouble, and then they would be called to announce that to the people. That's what Ezekiel is called by God to do. He's a watchman on the wall. But let's go back to, I'm going to paraphrase much of this first chapter. This is the call that Ezekiel's been called to. He says, God is basically saying, say what I tell you to, and if they don't listen to your warnings, it's on them. You're responsible to do what I tell you to do and to say what I tell you to say. If you don't obey and do what you're called to do, and you don't stand as a watchman, not only will the people that I've called you to speak to, will they die, but you will be held accountable as well. Because here's the point. God's goal through all of this was that sinners would repent. His desire is that people would come back to him. In fact, this passage reiterates what the earlier passage in Ezekiel said, which is God says, I take no delight in the death of the wicked. I'm not looking forward to people dying. They're my creation. I love them. I want them to come back to me. That's my hope. In fact, he continues to say, if somebody who's wicked repents and turns back to what is right and what is true, their sins won't be remembered. On the other hand, if somebody is righteous and starts out faithfully following God, but then falls away and goes living the other direction, their righteous deeds will not be remembered. And what God wraps up with in this passage, he says, I'm just and you are wrong. Because Israel's been pointing back to God and saying, why is this happening to us? This is not fair. That we don't deserve this. We're your people. And God says, no, what's coming your way is actually what is right and just. I've already talked to you about this. You committed to it, and I'm holding you accountable. Let's go down to the next part of the insert. One of the things that Ezekiel's going to have to do is he's going to have to sweep the last bit of hope away. So we're kind of at a point where things are changed, almost like the land is being cleansed, but there's still some remnants of this false hope. And so he needs to have false hope swept away for them to really get the message. So take a look at verse 21. In the 12th year of our exile, so remember, Ezekiel's in exile in Babylon. He has been for a number of years now. In the 10th month, on the 5th day, a man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and he said, the city has fallen. So he's gotten word back finally of Jerusalem being destroyed. Now the evening before the man arrived, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he opened my mouth before the man came to me in the morning. So my mouth was opened and I was no longer silent. That was kind of a key thing in Ezekiel's calling to ministry, is that he could only speak when God told him to speak. Verse 23, then when the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, the people living in those ruins in the land of Israel are saying, Abraham was only one man, yet he possessed the land, but we are many. Surely the land has been given to us as our possession. Let's kind of walk back through this. This person that escaped from the attack in Jerusalem, it took about 2 years for them to make it to Babylon. So the exiles now on January 8th, 585 are finally getting word that their hopes are being dashed. The city of God's dwelling, the temple, was gone. And another key part here is that Ezekiel's mouth has been opened. He's released from his inability to speak, and it meant that there's a beginning of a new phase of ministry. And this phase is going to be more hopeful. If you've read up to this point, you're going, man, it's pretty dire. It's not only graphic, but it's a real downer. And now things are going to turn. There's a corner that's going to be turned. But before he does that, Ezekiel has to get rid of that last bit of hope that Israel's clinging to falsely. See, some of the people were left within the city, and they remained. And so they were thinking like this, we're Abraham's children, and Abraham was only one man, and he possessed all of this promised land. This was his at God's giving. Well, there's a good number of us still left. How much more are we going to take the land back? And here's the problem. They're still not getting the message, because Abraham was blessed because he was faithful. What these people don't realize is that this judgment has come upon them because they're not faithful. A side note, when God calls Ezekiel to be the watchman, part of the goal of a watchman is to warn about the enemy coming. Here's what's interesting. In Ezekiel, God is the enemy. God is telling Ezekiel, I want you to warn these people that if they don't get their act together, it's not going to be that price to pay, it's going to be me. I'm the one coming against them. I'm the one who stands against Israel. And so they weren't understanding that. And so finally, with this last-ditch effort and the city being destroyed, finally they can start to see things differently. Well, the same mindset happens in the New Testament. In John chapter 8, Jesus is speaking to a Jewish crowd, and it's a famous passage where Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am. And it's a declaration of his divinity, of the fact that he is, before all of this happened, I knew Abraham, I'm God. Well, they're in the midst of this conversation, they're going, what are you talking about? I say, we're sons of Abraham. We're the children of Abraham. And Jesus says, no, you're not. You're demon spawn. I mean, basically what he says, you're sons of Satan. Those are not very kind words, but he's saying, I want you to understand, you are fooled by thinking that somehow just because you were born into the family in the flesh, that makes you right with God. But you are not of God in the heart. And so he's correcting them then and later. And so now God's going to begin to restore some hope. Because take a look at the next part of your insert. Not only does Ezekiel then wipe away the last remnant of false hope, but he starts to extend true hope. And if you read through the rest of this chapter, you'll find that Ezekiel, first of all, is vindicated. But it's a rough vindication, because what he's been saying, he's saying destruction is coming. It's not good. I was right. Yay me. That's not the kind of thing that you celebrate, but he really is vindicated, and the people that are there as exiles in Babylon start to recognize we got a true prophet in our midst. But what he does do is he draws them back. He's saying there is hope, and here's what hope looks like. Hope looks like returning to God. Hope looks like owning up to your sin. Hope looks like repentance and living for him. Now, that is not only true for Israel, that's true for us as well. You see, sometimes, just like Israel, people can live under the false impression that God owes them. And that's really what they were thinking. We're the apple of your eye, right? We're your chosen people, so we've got this coming. People in America and within the church can have a similar attitude. I'm pretty good. I'm better than other people. And therefore, God owes me. In fact, we get really riled up when something bad happens and comes our way, because we think we don't deserve that. It shouldn't be coming our way. And yet God's message through Ezekiel to Israel is a message to us today as well. We can fall prey to the same kind of false hope. The true hope that is extended is when we turn to God and we live for him. And here's the goal of this message in Ezekiel. He desires to bless his people. He longs for people to return to him. He wants to restore hope. Well, the next movement in this passage is Ezekiel's call is redirected. Not only is it renewed, but it's redirected. It's shifted a little bit. And underneath that, I'm going to kind of hold these two together. It's flattery versus rejection. If we remember back to when Ezekiel was first called in the early verses of Ezekiel, first chapter, second chapter, God tells Ezekiel, I'm sending you to an obstinate people. They are hard-headed, but I will make your head even harder. I will make your forehead like a stone, he says, and you will stand firm. Rejection is not as much going to be the issue right now. It's going to be flattery. Look at verse 30. As for you, son of man, your people are talking together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses. There's a buzz. Your name is on everybody's lips, Ezekiel. And each of them say, come and hear the message that has come from the Lord. My people come to you as they usually do, and they sit before you to hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. They're coming and they're hanging out and say, what do you got to say to us today, prophet? But there's a problem. They're not really looking to do what he says. Their mouths speak of love, but their hearts are greedy for unjust gain. Indeed, to them you are nothing more than one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays an instrument well. For they hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. When all this comes true, and it surely will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them. You see, now Ezekiel's really popular. Everybody wants to see Ezekiel. Maybe they even applaud when he gets done speaking and go, oh, it's beautiful. Man, I couldn't have said that any better. That's awesome stuff. In fact, some may have wished to jump on a bandwagon to gain some financial gain. He says, in there, he talks about the fact that they are greedy. So it's possible that somebody comes along and says, Ezekiel, some money could be made here. You do realize that. You're a star now. You're a mega prophet. We could put you out there and just think of the crowds and the T-shirts and the lights. I mean, we could make a living here. That sounds pretty modern, doesn't it? Somebody really gets big. Books and tours and stages, and they're a spokesperson for God. Christopher Wright mentions this. He says, the temptation to believe that now at last everybody is listening to me, so I'm a success after all, can be a dangerous illusion. There's a danger to being a popular preacher. I don't know how many times I've heard individuals who really like their pastor say, oh man, our pastor's so cool. You know what he did. I know you say that a lot, but I just want to say it's really not necessary. You usually kind of got to be a little, red flags ought to go up when there's so much talk about pastor, much more than there's about Jesus. When the pastor gets so big you can't see Jesus, there's a problem. St. Jerome, who spoke in the 300-400s, was a church leader. He said, even back then, shun as you would the plague a cleric or a minister who from being poor has become wealthy or who from being nobody has become a celebrity. There's danger in that. When you start to believe your press, either bad or good, there's danger because then the voice of God gets drowned out. But it's also dangerous for the crowd. Because what could happen in that setting back then as well as today is to say, somehow by proximity, I got the t-shirt, I stood near him, I got a picture with him or with her, somehow I'm closer to God because of my sense of connection with this somebody who is so popular, so important, so anointed. So just as it's dangerous for the prophet and the pastor, it's dangerous for the people because they lose sight of God in the midst of it. Let's move on to the next kind of movement in this. And now things really start to head in a direction where God is pointing them to what he's planning to do. Ezekiel then, he has a call to restoration. Ezekiel is given a call to restoration. We'll go to chapter 34 now. 34 beginning in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? Well, my sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. So before we get to restoration, there's still a little bit of cleanup work that needs to be done. And right now, he wants to call the leaders to account. Take a look at your insert. God calls out bad shepherds. The kings of Judah that were in Jerusalem, especially this last group of them, were bad leaders. I mean, there were occasionally some good leaders, but there were some significant wickedness in the palace. They didn't shepherd the flock well. They didn't care for the sheep. They even led them astray. And once they went astray, they didn't try to reel them in. They were bad shepherds. At this time in history, the image of a shepherd or a king or a leader as a shepherd was actually pretty common, not just for Israel, but for others. And it makes sense because you're living in a shepherding culture. And so it is a perfect application for the kind of leader that God is after. The problem in today's culture is that we're more impacted by business. And so many people see the pastor as a CEO rather than a shepherd, at the top of a pyramid rather than as a spiritual leader. And I've used this reference before. The book that I have in my one of the books I have in my library is called "They Smell Like Sheep." And again, the emphasis is that God has modeled leadership after shepherds. Now, shepherds have a tough road to hoe because they have to be in and among the sheep. They have to be in and among the flock. And if they don't smell like the sheep, if they don't recognize the voice of the shepherd, if they don't recognize the indications that mark out this shepherd, they have a tendency to run away. And so in order to be a good shepherd, you've got to be out and care for the flock. You've got to be near the people for them to recognize your voice. You've got to earn the right to be heard. The challenge is that even today we have far too many leaders who are not leading folks into truth or standing against the current of the culture, but merely in it for themselves, as if they're somehow climbing some sort of spiritual corporate ladder, moving up the rungs, that one day I'll make it to this stage. That's not what the shepherd of God's people are called to do or to be. In fact, he goes on, look at verse 12. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. Notice the change. He's initially calling the bad shepherds to account, the kings and leaders among God's people, because they weren't faithful, and now he's changing the pronoun. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will tend them in good pastures, and in the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and will bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and I will strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. And as for my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Look at your insert. This is a really significant change in the message, that God declares himself the good shepherd. In other words, Yahweh, God, is saying, I have a concern because this is my flock. All of the ones who went before me, the kings and even the religious leaders, were under shepherds. I'm the ultimate shepherd. Well, during a period of uprising, I don't think it's a more recent uprising, but there have been so many in the Middle East. But during one of those, Ron and Joki Jones, who serve with the Christian Missionary Alliance in Israel, communicated the following in one of their prayer letters. He said, the result of the fighting and killing has left a profound sense of discouragement that hovers over the country. Several times we have come into close contact with this conflict, closer than our comfort zone allowed. Well, yesterday a friend shared with us something that she observed that was a delightful reminder of God's care for us. She watched a shepherd caring for his flock near the area where the guns are fired. And every time the shots rang out, the sheep scattered in fright. The shepherd then touched each of them with his staff, and he spoke calmly to them. And the sheep settled down immediately because they trusted the shepherd. And then another shot sounded, and the same routine happened again. And each time the sheep needed the shepherd to orient them again and to reassure them that they were safe. We are like those sheep, and our shepherd reaches out, touches us with his staff, and speaking words of calm and comfort, he brings us to himself. You see, the kings and the shepherds of God had failed the flock, but God was always meant to be their ultimate shepherd. In fact, he was meant to be their king. Take a look at your next line on your insert, that God had always been the true king, whether they understood that or not. In fact, won't be on the screen, but I want to bring your memory back to the time before they had a king. In the book of Judges and then into 1 Samuel, you have God raising up spiritual leaders. So they had leaders and they kind of shepherded God's people, but they weren't kings in the typical sense. And then finally, in 1 Samuel in chapter 8, the people of God are crying out for a king. They want a king like everybody else has. And in chapter 8, verse 6, God says, but when they said to you, give us a king to lead us, when they said this displeased Samuel. And so he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all the people are saying to you. Go ahead and give them what they want. And here's why. It's not you they've rejected, but they've rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. God is declaring, this is my flock, I am the king, I am the shepherd. And that sometimes needs to be reiterated in the church. Jesus is called the chief shepherd. It's not my church, it's not your church, it's his church. He's the one who is at the top of this. If there is a pyramid, so to speak, he's at the top of that. The power behind every throne is God. So when pastors and elders or government leaders or anybody else forget that they are put there by the hand of God, they miss who God is. They miss who is in charge. And so what follows next then, beyond this calling out of the shepherds and God declaring himself as shepherd, is really Ezekiel's gospel. Christopher Wright refers this as to the gospel according to Ezekiel. And gospel is, if you're not familiar, is the word for good news, declaring good news. In particular, we think of the gospel about Jesus, that the good news is that salvation is offered, forgiveness and healing and all of this. But it didn't begin with John or Matthew or Mark or Luke. It started throughout the Bible. And Ezekiel's presenting an image of what the gospel looks like. You see, God will gather and he will tend and feed the flock and he will bring justice. What he's envisioning is restoration on the same terms of what they're familiar with. For restoration for God's people in the ancient world, it would have been the temple restored and the land and safety and health. In fact, what's being envisioned here is the Hebrew term shalom. Shalom is a term that's even used today among Jewish people as a greeting and as a farewell. And it's not just, hey, goodbye. It's not just like aloha. It means something deeply spiritual, theological. It's a term for wholeness, that true peace, that the best of life and health and all that God has to offer will be yours. That's what's being pictured here. No wonder then in John chapter 10, Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. Do you know the context in which he's saying that? Verse 11, he says, I'm the good shepherd. I've come to restore what is broken. I've come to lift up what has fallen. Jesus is doing that. In fact, when Jesus comes, it's holistic. His gospel, he doesn't just come to preach, he heals. He casts out demons. He brings peace. He restores brokenness. And so in the midst of what Jesus does in his ministry is he points back to what Ezekiel has been saying all along, that this is what God intends. In fact, I want to go back in your mind to the passage we just read from. Did you notice all the other connections to Jesus? Jesus is not only the good shepherd. Jesus says, I came to seek and to save that was lost. And one of the parables he uses is finding the one lost sheep and carrying him on his shoulders. Jesus in Matthew 25 says that on that day of judgment, there will be a dividing of the sheep and the goats. It's almost as if when Jesus is speaking, he's got Ezekiel in his mind. And he's saying, that points to me. In fact, when we go back to the sheep and the goats, there's one of the things that Ezekiel says, and the same thing that Jesus says, part of the good news is judgment, which seems weird. I thought good news means it's all really good, and it's not that. He said, no, in order for things to be really, really good, bad also has to be dealt with. Evil has to be cast out. Sin needs to be addressed. No wonder then that this term of people, his people as sheep, is Jesus' favorite expression of his people. He called us as his flock. Then go down to verse 23 rather. And God says, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and he will be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. God then will also send a prince, a king, a shepherd, the true shepherd. Well, by what I've said already, it's not a big leap to realize that's Jesus he's talking about. that Jesus will be the one from the line of David. In fact, as we come to Christmas, you may read through some of the Christmas stories, even in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Jesus is that one that is born to be on the throne forever. And so Jesus then says, as I mentioned earlier, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. See, this is a picture of a time when God will restore shalom through Jesus. And it looks to an age that began with Jesus. It will be fully experienced, I believe, when he returns the second time. Which is why I would caution us from hearing this as, well, when is the land of Israel going to look like this? I think he's envisioning something greater beyond the land of Israel. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. This isn't on the screen, but I want to share this with you. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and he went, even though he did not know where he was going. He's talking about the promised land that was going to be promised to his descendants. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign land, like an alien. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. In verse 10, this is significant. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. You see, the promise is envisioned here, not merely of physical Israel, but it's all of God's people, and that God is building this eternal city that will last beyond this life. God will shepherd his people and he will bring them into his fold. What a beautiful picture. The words of Ezekiel now start to turn hopeful. After dealing with the brokenness, God is ready to restore. This morning as we come to communion, it's a reminder of that restoration that comes through Jesus. That Jesus comes as the one, not only who's a shepherd, but he will lay down his life for his sheep. And what I find interesting is that Jesus is said to be a son of David, kind of the model king. David is called a man after God's own heart. Well, what was David before he was a king? He was a shepherd. In fact, many of God's leaders in the Old Testament were shepherds before they ever became prophets or kings. And one of his favorite psalms, or at least the favorite psalms in terms of readers throughout history, has been the 23rd Psalm. And so I want to read the 23rd Psalm, which depicts much of what's just been portrayed in Ezekiel. And I want to speak it over you. I want to say it over you as we prepare our hearts and our minds for communion, for you to realize that God is this shepherd for you, that Jesus is this shepherd for you, that he has a vision of what he hopes for you, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it's amazing. And allow this to kind of prepare your hearts and your minds as you come to communion. Before I read this, though, I want to just say, if you're a Christian with us this morning, you're welcome to partake. You don't have to be a member here at Bailey, but as the trays are passed, go ahead and take the cups and spend some time there with the Lord. And then afterwards, just go ahead and put the empty cups in the holders in front of you. So, in fact, I invite you to close your eyes and to listen to these words spoken over you today. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Lord, shepherd of our souls, we come to you. We wander like sheep. We get lost. We lose our way, and yet you love us enough to bring us back in. And so wherever we have wandered, I pray that we would come back to you today. I pray that wherever our hearts or minds have not been where they ought to be, I pray that you would reveal that to us and that you'd cleanse us. I pray that we come to you with clean hearts, clean minds, clean hands. We just want to say thank you for loving us like a shepherd cares for, tenderly and fiercely fights for his flock. Thank you for loving us that way. May we view you as that tender but fierce shepherd who loves and cares. And may we reflect that as if we're called to leadership, one of service and of love and of sacrifice, just as you modeled that for us. For you came to seek and to save that which was lost, and you, being the good shepherd, laid down your life for us. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Hey, I'm Joel Malone, one of the elders here at Bailey Christian Church. We are so glad you joined us online today. Thank you for streaming on whatever platform you're using. Just remember to drop us a note and let us know that you are here and watching, and we would love to have you visit us in person sometime. Our doors are always open. If you have any needs or prayer concerns, just go to our website and check us out there, send us a message, and we'd be happy to be in contact with you. Have a great week.